The instant the woman in black made her way through saloon doors, an unnatural silence settled on Murphy's. She walked like a shadow brought to life, every step methodical, every look calculated. Words shriveled on lips as men unconsciously laid their hand on gun belts, although not a one could explain why. Her glove-clad hand rested on the rim of her hat as her eyes scanned the room, finally coming to rest on Thomas Razor Murphy, fat with whiskey and conceit in his favorite corner. There came a sly smile across her mouth, the sort that made morticians nervous. 5 years of ease had made the previously gaunt outlaw into a sweating, shaking fool who still flinched at thunder, but bragged every night about reducing Thorn Ranch to ashes. This evening, he was telling some drunken rowdy about handling settlers with exaggerated descriptions when the chair facing him scraped back. She sat down without invitation, the kerosene lamp etching her face between statue and specter. Murphy's anger disappeared the instant he looked into her eyes, eyes that saw things dead men shouldn't. "You don't remember me, do you, Thomas?" Her voice was a velvet-hilted razor. She placed on the space between them a charred piece of wood, the letter T still burned into what was left of a ranch sign. Murphy's jowls shook. His sausage fingers jerked toward his Colt. Stayed. She hadn't budged. Didn't have to. 5 years of suspense wound in her frame like a rattlesnake ready to strike. "Cordelia Thorne perished in that blaze," he growled, more boy than murderer. Her laughter was the parched crinkle of a hangman's noose closing. Strange what people opt to believe. Cordelia moved closer, and the light from the lamp caught a network of scars along her left cheek. Scars that hadn't been there the last time Murphy had looked at her. Her tone was soothing, verging on conversation. "Such is how you informed the Sheriff Samuel began that blaze himself. How you talked the entire town into believing we were harboring outlaws. How you ensured no one paid too close attention to the truth." Murphy's chair scraped against the wooden floor with a sharp scraping sound as he attempted to pull back from the table. But her hand shot out, and her hand locked around his wrist with a strength he hadn't expected. He could feel, even through gloves, the rough, ridged texture of burn scars. "I've thought about you every day for 5 years, Thomas," she told him, her voice hard and even. "Thought about whether you still wake up screaming. Wondered if you still hear Samuel's voice when the fire hits." She cocked her head to one side, listening to something only she could hear. What Murphy did not know, what he could not know, was that she had poisoned his whiskey in advance before he ever pushed open the saloon door. The Jimson weed was taking effect rapidly now, more so than most would anticipate. Not fatal, merely sufficient to cause a man's legs to remember they were no longer holding him. Murphy staggered, pushing over his chair as a hum of attention rolled through the saloon. "Easy there, Thomas," Cordelia called out loudly, pretending to worry. "Looks like you've had a bit too much tonight." She caught him as he teetered, holding him up like a concerned friend helping a drunkard. Her grip was iron. To the watching crowd, she was nothing more than a kind stranger doing a good deed. Murphy tried to speak, to warn someone, anyone, but his tongue felt thick and useless, his vision blurring as the world tilted around him. Cordelia nodded to the bartender with a warm smile. "I'll make sure he gets home safe," she called. "Poor man's just overworked." The moment the saloon door closed behind them, her kindness vanished. In the narrow alley behind the building, she shoved him hard against a brick wall. He crumpled to the dirt helpless, his wide eyes filled with panic as his limbs betrayed him. Cordelia bent down so that they were eye to eye, her voice cold and low. "Jimson weed," she went on. "I learned it from a Comanche woman who discovered me when you abandoned me to burn." Hilarious, isn't it? The so-called savages, who you claim knew nothing about mercy, taught me more of it than any so-called civilized man such as yourself. She pulled out a small leather journal and opened it to a page marked with a black ribbon. Murphy's name was written at the top in careful script, followed by detailed notes about his daily routine, his drinking habits, and the names of every person he'd murdered over the years. "This is going to take about 2 hours to work its way through your system. Thomas, 2 hours where you can hear everything, see everything, but you can't move a muscle, can't even scream." She turned the page, showing him a list of 3 names, his own Silas Kane and Dutch Hartwell. His name already had a line drawn through it, Murphy's eyes rolled frantically as she continued reading from her journal. Every detail of what his life had become, how he'd spent Samuel's stolen money on, and whiskey, how he'd told the story of burning them out so many times it had become his favorite joke. The best part is, you're going to be conscious for all of it. You'll feel every single thing that's about to happen to you. Just like Samuel felt every flame. She closed the journal and stood up, brushing the dirt off her black dress. But as she turned to leave the alley, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The distinctive whistle that Silas Kane always used to signal his deputies. He was coming this way, and he was bringing help. Cordelia's fingers found the knife hidden in her dress, as Sheriff Silas Kane rounded the corner, with two deputies flanking him. Kane had aged badly. His once black hair was streaked with gray, and his gut hung over his gun belt like a sack of grain. But his eyes were still the same cold blue that had watched her ranch burn without lifting a finger to help. "Well, well," Kane drawled, his hand resting on his pistol. "Heard there was some commotion back here. Strange woman helping drunk men in dark alleys?" His gaze swept over Murphy's paralyzed form, slumped against the wall. "That's real Christian of you, miss." She turned slowly, keeping her hands visible, her face a mask of innocent concern. "Sheriff Kane, thank goodness you're here." This poor man collapsed right outside the saloon. "I was just trying to help him get some fresh air." Kane's eyes narrowed as he studied her face in the dim moonlight. Something about her voice made his skin crawl, like he'd heard it before in a nightmare. He couldn't quite remember. Funny thing about helping folks. He said, stepping closer, "Most good Samaritans don't wear all black like they're dressed for a funeral. Maybe because some of us know death when we see it coming." She replied, and Kane's blood turned to ice water in his veins. That voice, he knew that voice. It belonged to a ghost that should have burned to ash 5 years ago. His hand moved toward his gun, but Cordelia was faster. The knife flew from her fingers, like a silver bird burying itself in the throat of the deputy, to Kane's left before anyone could blink. The second deputy went for his weapon, but Kane grabbed his arm. "No, you fool, alive! We need her alive!" But the young deputy was already firing wild shots into the darkness, where Cordelia had been standing a heartbeat before she moved like smoke through the shadows of the alley, using every crate and barrel for cover. Kane could hear her breathing somewhere in the darkness, could smell the faint scent of smoke that seemed to follow her like a curse. The surviving deputy was spinning in circles, his gun shaking in his hands. "Cordelia Thorne," Kane called out to the shadows, "I should have made sure you burned completely the first time." Her laughter echoed off the brick walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You did burn me completely. Silas, what's standing here now is something else entirely. Something you made." A bottle crashed against the wall next to Kane's head, and in the split second he flinched away from the glass, Cordelia emerged from behind a wooden crate. She tackled the surviving deputy, and they went down hard on the cobblestones, but Kane had his gun out now, and he had a clear shot at both of them. What he didn't know was that Dutch Hartwell was watching from his office window across the street, and he just recognized the woman who was supposed to be dead. Dutch Hartwell dropped his brandy glass, and it shattered across his office floor like his carefully constructed world. From his second-story window, he could see the woman who'd haunted his nightmares, wrestling with a deputy in the alley below. The same woman whose ranch he'd paid Murphy to burn, the same woman who should have been nothing but bones and ash by now. His hands shook as he reached for the telegraph key on his desk. If Cordelia Thorne was alive, if she was here in Dust Creek, then she knew everything she knew about the payments, about the forged documents, about the railroad contracts that had made him rich beyond his wildest dreams. She knew why Samuel Thorne had to die down in the alley. Cordelia drove her knee into the deputy's ribs and felt them crack like kindling. She rolled away just as Kane's bullet sparked off the cobblestones where her head had been. The deputy groaned and tried to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood behind him. 5 years I've been planning this." "Silas," she called out, darting between the shadows. 5 years, thinking about how you stood there and watched my home burn. How you told the town that Samuel was a criminal who got what he deserved." Kane fired again, the muzzle flash lighting up his sweating face. "He was harboring stolen cattle. We had evidence. You had lies." Her voice cracked like a whip across the night air. "Lies that Dutch Hartwell paid you to believe. Lies that cleared us off our land so the railroad could run their track straight through our property. She appeared behind a water barrel, and Kane spun toward her, but she was already moving again. The cat and mouse game was wearing on his nerves, making his hands shake. He'd never been good under pressure, not like Murphy. Murphy had always been the one who enjoyed the dirty work. "Where is that fat bastard anyway?" Kane muttered, glancing toward where Murphy sat, paralyzed against the wall. The man's eyes were wide and terrified, but he couldn't move a muscle. "What did you do to him?" I gave him time to think about what he'd done. "Just like I'm going to give you," Cordelia's voice seemed to come from right behind him, and Kane spun around, firing wildly into the darkness. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. In the silence that followed, Cordelia stepped out of the shadows like she was made of moonlight and vengeance. Kane fumbled for his spare ammunition, but his hands were shaking too badly to load the bullets. "If you were Kane," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the alley, "what would you do? Beg for mercy from the woman whose husband you helped murder, or try to run and hope she doesn't catch you? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Kane decided next would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise." Kane chose to run. He bolted toward the street, his boots slipping on the wet cobblestones. But Cordelia had planned for this moment for 5 long years, and she knew every inch of this town. She knew exactly where he would go, and she knew the shortcut that would get her there first. What Kane didn't know was that Dutch Hartwell was already sending a telegram to bring in hired guns from 3 counties away. Kane burst through the front door of his own jail, gasping like a drowning man. His hands fumbled for the rifle rack on the wall, but before he could reach it, Cordelia's voice drifted through the barred window like smoke. "I'm already here, Silas." He spun around to find her sitting calmly in one of his own jail cells. The door hanging open behind her. She'd somehow gotten there ahead of him, and now she was holding his Winchester rifle across her lap, like she owned the place. "How did you?" Kane's voice cracked. He backed against the wall, his eyes darting toward the front door. But Cordelia was already standing, the rifle trained on his chest. "You always were slow," she said, stepping out of the cell. "That's why Dutch used Murphy for the real work. You were just the badge, weren't you? The official face that made everything look legal." Kane's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Sweat poured down his face as memories flooded back. The night Dutch had approached him, with the proposition, the railroad map spread across his desk, the stack of gold coins that had seemed like a fortune to a small-town sheriff. "Dutch never told you the whole truth, did he?" Cordelia continued, keeping the rifle steady, about why Samuel really had to die. It wasn't just about the land. Silas, Samuel had found something. She reached into her dress and pulled out a leather document case. One Kane recognized with growing horror. It was Samuel Thorne's surveying equipment, the same gear that had been destroyed in the fire, or so they'd thought, mineral rights. She said, opening the case and showing him the official papers inside. Samuel had filed a claim for copper deposits 3 days before you killed him. Copper that would have made us richer than Dutch ever dreamed of being. Kane's knees gave out, and he slumped against the wall. The railroad had been a cover story. Dutch hadn't just wanted their land for the tracks. He'd wanted the mineral rights that would have belonged to Samuel's heirs by killing them both. He'd planned to claim the abandoned property and all its hidden wealth. "That's impossible," Kane whispered. "The fire destroyed everything. There were no survivors, no heirs, because you never bothered to check if I was actually dead." Cordelia's finger tightened on the trigger. "You saw the house burning and assumed your job was done. But I crawled out of that basement half dead and more angry than you could possibly imagine." The jail door creaked open behind her, and Dutch Hartwell stepped inside, flanked by 4 men. Kane didn't recognize professional killers by the look of them. With dead eyes and fast hands. "Well, well," Dutch said, straightening his expensive jacket. "The dead do rise, it seems. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." But Cordelia was smiling, and that terrified Kane more than the guns pointed at his back. "You always were too clever for your own good," Dutch, Cordelia said without turning around, the rifle in her hands. Never wavered from Kane's chest, even with 4 guns pointed at her back. But not quite clever enough. Dutch Hartwell had put on weight and expensive clothes since becoming the richest man in Dust Creek. But his eyes were still the same calculating gray that had sealed Samuel's death warrant. He stepped closer, confident in his hired protection. 5 years, Cordelia, 5 years. You could have stayed dead and saved everyone a lot of trouble. He gestured to his men, and they spread out across the small jail, cutting off every escape route. Instead, you had to come back and complicate things. She laughed, and the sound made Kane's skin crawl Dutch. I haven't even started complicating things yet. See, while you've been getting fat off my husband's grave, I've been very busy. She reached into her coat with her free hand and tossed a stack of papers onto Kane's desk. Dutch picked them up, and his face went white as winter. Snow railroad contracts, he breathed. How did you? Turns out, railroad executives aren't as loyal as you thought. Amazing what a woman can learn when she's got nothing left to lose. In 5 years to plan, Cordelia's voice was honey over broken glass. They were very interested to hear about a small-town businessman who'd been forging mineral surveys and murdering landowners. Dutch's hands shook as he read through the documents. His carefully constructed empire was built on lies and murder. And now every detail was laid out in black and white, signed by the very men who'd made him rich. The railroad pulled their contracts yesterday morning. Cordelia continued. Seems they don't like doing business with murderers. Bad for their reputation. Your banknotes come due next week, don't they, Dutch? One of the hired killers stepped forward, his hand hovering over his gun boss. We should just finish this now. But Dutch held up a trembling hand. His mind was racing, calculating losses, adding up debts without the railroad money. He was ruined, worse than ruined. He was a poor man with rich man's enemies. You think you've won? Dutch's voice cracked like thin ice. Even if the railroad cuts me loose, you're still a dead woman. These men don't work for the railroad, Cordelia. They work for me, and I pay them very well to solve problems. Problems like witnesses? She asked, and something in her tone made the hired killers exchange nervous glances. What witnesses? Dutch demanded. Cordelia smiled, and for the first time since entering the jail, she looked genuinely happy. The witnesses I've been collecting for 5 years. People who remember your midnight meetings with Murphy. People who saw you pay Kane to look the other way. People who helped forge those mineral surveys. She nodded toward the window, and Dutch turned to see torches moving through the streets, dozens of them carried by angry towns, people who'd finally learned the truth about their respected businessman and his pet sheriff. They're coming for you, Dutch. All of them. Turns out people don't like being lied to for 5 years. But what none of them knew was that Murphy had finally shaken off enough of the poison to crawl to his hidden shotgun, and he was about to turn this confrontation into a bloodbath. The shotgun blast shattered the jail window and sent everyone diving for cover. Murphy had dragged himself to the alley entrance, his legs still mostly useless, but his arms working well enough to aim glass, and wood splinters filled the air as his second barrel took out one of Dutch's hired killers. Razor! Dutch screamed, but Murphy wasn't listening to anyone anymore. The poison had cleared his head enough to realize he was a dead man either way. Either Cordelia would kill him, or Dutch would have him eliminated to tie up loose ends. He had nothing left to lose. Cordelia rolled behind Kane's desk as bullets started flying. The remaining 3 killers were shooting at everything that moved, and Kane was pressed flat against the wall, whimpering like a kicked dog. Dutch had produced a small pistol from his vest and was trying to get a clear shot at Cordelia. This is your fault, Dutch shouted over the gunfire. None of this would have happened if you just stayed buried. You're right, Cordelia, called back her voice, eerily calm, despite the chaos. I should have stayed dead, but Samuel wouldn't let me. She rose from behind the desk with a gun in each hand, Kane's service pistol and her own pearl-handled Colt. The hired killers turned toward her, but she was already moving, rolling sideways as their shots splintered the floor where she'd been crouching. Murphy fired again from the doorway, and another killer went down screaming, but the effort left him exposed, and Dutch put 2 bullets in his chest. The fat man slumped forward, his eyes already glazing over one. Down, Dutch muttered, turning back toward Cordelia, but she was gone. The remaining 2 killers spun in circles, searching the smoke-filled jail. Kane was still pressed against the wall, his hands over his head, completely useless. Dutch backed toward the rear door, his pistol shaking in his hands. Where is she? One of the killers hissed. The answer came from above their heads. Cordelia had somehow gotten into the jail's small attic space, and now she dropped through the ceiling tiles like an avenging angel. She landed on the closest killer's back, driving her knife between his shoulder blades before he could turn around. The last killer spun and fired, but Cordelia was already moving. She used the dying man as a shield, then put 2 bullets sent her mass into the final gunman. He dropped like a sack of grain, and suddenly the jail was quiet, except for Kane's terrified sobbing. Dutch stood alone by the back door, his expensive clothes torn and bloody, his carefully groomed hair wild with sweat and plaster dust. His pistol was empty, and Cordelia was walking toward him with death in her eyes. "Please," he whispered. "It was just business, nothing personal, nothing personal." Cordelia's voice was barely human anymore. "You killed my husband for money. You destroyed my life for copper in the ground." But as she raised her gun to end Dutch Hartwell's miserable existence, the front door of the jail exploded inward, and the angry mob poured inside. The mob filled the jail like floodwater, 20 angry townspeople carrying torches and shotguns. They'd heard the gunfire, seen the bodies, and now they wanted answers. Dutch pressed himself against the back wall as familiar faces surrounded him. Shopkeepers, farmers, people he'd considered beneath his notice for years. "String him up," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Hang them both," yelled another voice. But Cordelia held up her hand, and somehow the mob fell silent. Blood dripped from a cut on her forehead, and her black dress was torn and powder-burned. But she stood like a queen addressing her subjects. "This man," she said, pointing at Dutch with her still-smoking pistol, "murdered my husband for money he paid Murphy and Kane to burn us out, so he could steal our land and the copper underneath it." The crowd murmured angrily, pressing closer to Dutch, but Cordelia wasn't finished. "Kane helped him," she continued, nodding toward the terrified sheriff still cowering against the wall. "He provided the badge that made it all look legal. The forged documents, the false charges, the lies that turned you all against innocent people." "We should have known," said Mrs. Patterson. "The woman who ran the general store, Samuel Thorne, never caused trouble for anyone. But I'm not going to kill them," Cordelia announced, and the crowd fell silent with surprise. Dutch's eyes widened with hope, but Cordelia's smile was colder than a winter grave. "I'm going to let you decide what happens to them. They stole from all of us. They murdered in our town's name. They made us accomplices to their crimes." She stepped back, still covering both men with her guns. "So what's it going to be?" The crowd's answer was swift and unanimous. They surged forward, and Dutch's scream was cut short as dozens of hands dragged him toward the door. Kane tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The townspeople had waited 5 years to learn the truth, and now they were going to deliver their own justice. Cordelia watched from the jail doorway as the mob carried Dutch and Kane toward the old hanging tree at the edge of town. She felt no satisfaction, no relief, no peace. The flames that had consumed her husband still burned in her chest, and she suspected they always would as dawn broke over Dust Creek. 2 bodies swayed from the oak trees, heavy branches. The townspeople had delivered their verdict, and justice, rough and final, had been served. Cordelia walked through the empty streets one last time. Her revenge complete, but her heart still empty. She'd proven that Samuel's death had been murder, not justice. She'd exposed the corruption that had poisoned their town, but none of it could bring him back at the train station. She bought a ticket heading west toward California and a new life under a new name. The copper mine that had cost Samuel his life would make her rich beyond Dutch Hartwell's wildest dreams, but money felt like ash in her hands as the train pulled away from Dust Creek. Cordelia pressed her face to the window and watched the hanging tree disappear into the distance. Samuel was finally avenged. The truth was finally known, and the men who destroyed her life were finally dead. She never returned to Dust Creek, but the story of the woman in black who brought justice to a corrupt town became legend throughout the territory. Some said she'd become a bounty hunter, tracking down killers and thieves across the frontier. Others claimed she'd disappeared into the mountains, still hunting for the men who'd escaped her vengeance. But in Dust Creek, where 2 graves marked the end of 5 years of lies, the people remembered Cordelia Thorne as the ghost who'd returned from the flames to set their world right again. Now click on the video on the screen To hear a story even better than this one, with an ending so surprising you won't forget it anytime soon, click on the video now.